Welcome to the Bookish Breakdown. I'm Lem. Today we're going deep, really deep, into this book. It's called Operation Gladio, written by Paul Williams.
Hey everyone, I'm Abby. I actually just saw the top comment on Amazon for this book. Get this, it says, "Instead of the lies told in our schools today, students should be reading Operation Gladio."
Wow, that's a pretty strong statement. Okay, so Operation Gladio, it gets into these secret, clandestine stay-behind units that were formed all across Europe after World War II. The idea was, if the Soviets ever decided to invade, these units would be ready to resist, kind of like a secret resistance force. And the author, Paul Williams, he's not just some random guy writing about this stuff. He was an editor, a publisher, even an FBI consultant at one point, like a real insider. Some people might recognize him from his later work, The Vatican Exposed, which also delves into some pretty controversial stuff.
Yeah, and one thing that really jumps out at you when you start reading Operation Gladio is, well, the kind of sources Williams uses. He's not relying on, just anyone. He mentions respected scholars like Alfred McCoy, Peter Dale Scott, even Martin A. Lee. These are people who have really dug deep into this world of covert operations and intelligence networks. And he also kind of soberingly acknowledges those researchers and journalists who unfortunately, died while they were investigating these very networks. That definitely sets a serious tone right from the beginning.
For sure. And for this deep dive, we're focusing on something that you, our listeners, specifically asked about. The relationship between the Vatican and the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA. It's presented in the book as being, surprisingly close and very intricate. Not exactly the first two organizations that come to mind when you think about, partnerships.
Right. You don't usually picture those two working together. But Operation Gladio makes a pretty strong case that they were deeply connected, especially during the Cold War. And the book suggests that this connection, if you really think about it, could challenge some pretty fundamental ideas we have about both the Vatican and the CIA. Depending on what we uncover here, could even be, unsettling for some people. It might shake their faith in these institutions, which are often seen as forces for good, right?
Absolutely. And to really illustrate this connection, the book introduces us to some key players, some pretty important figures. We got Father Felix Morlian, who used to work for the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, and he founded this intelligence operation in Rome called Pro Dio. Then there's Licio Gelli, the Grand Master of the, infamous P2 Lodge. That's a whole other rabbit hole we could go down, but definitely a shadowy figure. And we can't forget Archbishop Paul Morsinkus, the head of the Vatican Bank. His role is central to this story. And then there's Michele Sindona, this financial advisor, who had, interesting connections to both the Vatican and the CIA. Some might even call them shady connections.
Yeah, and when you look at the timeline that Williams lays out in the book, what's really striking is just how early on this connection seems to have formed. He talks about something called Catholic Gladio being established as early as 1955. And then just a year later, you have Licio Gelli already working as, get this, the CIA's liaison to Italian military intelligence. This wasn't something that, developed later on. It seems like there was a pretty deep connection from the very beginning of the Cold War.
Okay, so let's try to unpack how this might have all started. How did the Vatican and the CIA end up, working together, especially right after World War II? The book really emphasizes how Alan Dulles, who was with the OSS at the time, saw the Soviet Union as the next big threat, like the new enemy. And he was willing to do, pretty much anything to counter that threat. I mean, there's this incredible detail about Dulles using Vatican messengers to try and contact Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, near the end of the war. He wanted to discuss post-war strategies, like how to deal with the Soviets. Just, you don't typically think of the Vatican as playing that kind of role, right?
Right. It's not exactly the usual diplomatic channel. And then there's this whole concept of stay-behind units, which is really fascinating, but also kind of disturbing when you think about where it came from. It was originally a Nazi idea developed by this general, Reinhard Gehlen. They called them werewolves. These units that would operate behind enemy lines, sabotage and resistance and all that. But Delays and the OSS in general, they recognized that this idea could be really useful in the context of the Cold War. So you have this kind of strange situation where they're taking a Nazi strategy and repurposing it to fight the Soviets.
And it gets even more unsettling when you see who they were recruiting for these stay-behind units. The book talks about Prince Junio Valerio Borghese, who had actually led fascist fighters during the war. James Angleton, another OSS guy, he brings Borghese in for these covert operations. And the book even suggests that Angleton went out of his way to make sure that Borghese was released from war crime charges. He was put into U.S. Army custody instead, which I guess protected him. So we're talking about former fascists being used by American intelligence to fight communism. It's pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
Yeah, it really shows how the priorities shifted after the war. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, even if that friend was, a fascist just a few years earlier. And then there's the whole financial side of this, which is a whole other can of worms. The book mentions this guy, Paul Helliwell, who was apparently instrumental in funneling money for these covert operations, especially in Asia, and the alleged source of some of this money, laundered Nazi gold. The book says it was moved through this company, the World Commerce Corporation, which had ties to Wild Bill Donovan, another big name in the OSS. So it's like they were potentially using money from the very people they had just defeated to finance these secret operations.
And the anti-communist ideology really seems to have been the driving force behind all of this. According to Operation Gladio, the U.S. and the CIA, they saw the Soviet Union as this existential threat, like the ultimate evil, as a new form of totalitarianism, and they felt like they had to do whatever it took to stop it. And that meant that any ally was welcome, and any means was justified. That even extended to working with the Mafia, which is just wild. The book details this operation called Operation Underworld, which took place during the Allied invasion of Sicily. Basically, the U.S. military collaborated with Lucky Luciano, the mob boss, to get intelligence. And get this, Monsignor Montini, who later became Pope Paul VI, he apparently played a role in making that happen.
Yeah, it wasn't just, a few backroom deals. The book describes how Vito Genovese, who was a key figure in Luciano's organization, he was actually appointed as the chief translator for the U.S. Army headquarters in Naples. Like, they brought him right into the fold. And this really highlights how much influence the Mafia gained through this collaboration with the U.S. It wasn't just about, getting a few tips. They were actually integrated into the structure of the U.S. military operation in Italy.
And then, of course, we have the formal creation of the CIA under Allen Dulles. The book talks about how they specifically targeted the elite for recruitment. We're talking bankers, lawyers, journalists, even academics. They wanted the best and the brightest, I guess, to carry out these covert operations. And Frank Wisner, he became the head of this new division called the Office of Policy Coordination, or OPC. It was basically the CIA's dirty tricks department. And they had access to tons of money, like a bottomless pit of cash.
Right. And that concentration of resources and power within the OPC, it's really important to understanding everything that comes later. The book highlights this alliance that the CIA allegedly formed with the Sicilian Mafia to try and influence Italian elections in the late 1940s and early 1950s. They were basically trying to stop the Communist Party from winning. And the book mentions Cardinal Francis Spellman being involved in this, and even the Vatican Bank being used to funnel payments to the Mafia. It's pretty shocking when you think about it. Elements within the church potentially being involved in political manipulation and using organized crime to do it.
And it wasn't just, peaceful campaigning. The book gives examples of actual violence and intimidation being used. Arson attacks on Communist Party offices, beatings, even assassinations of local leaders. It paints a pretty grim picture of what was happening on the ground in Italy. And it's important to remember, this is all allegedly happening with backing and financial support that had connections to the Vatican.
Yeah, and the CIA's support for these stay-behind units, it wasn't just limited to Italy. It was happening all across Western Europe. And the book raises a really troubling possibility that the funding for these operations, at least some of it, came from, the drug trade. Catholic banks like Banco Ambrosiano, they had this special status because of the Lateran Treaty, the agreement between the Vatican and Italy. It basically shielded them from Italian financial oversight, so they could be used to launder money, potentially. And that meant that the CIA could use them to move money around without anyone really knowing where it was coming from or where it was going.
Which leads to even more explosive claims in Operation Gladio. The book talks about the CIA actually establishing heroin trafficking routes, working with the Corsican and Sicilian mafias. And later on, they allegedly expanded this operation into Southeast Asia, the Golden Triangle, involving people like General Chiang Kai-shek and General Fao Sriananda. It even names specific CIA front companies like Civil Air Transport and Sea Supply Inc.
Hmm.
that were supposedly involved in moving these drugs. It's a deeply disturbing picture of intelligence agencies being complicit in the global drug trade.
And what makes it even more disturbing is that, according to the book, some of the people who are being targeted by the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Administration, they turned out to be working for the CIA. So it's like you have one part of the U.S. government trying to fight drug trafficking, and then another part is allegedly involved in making it happen. It's a really twisted situation.
The book also gets into the CIA's involvement in political destabilization, and not just through, influencing elections or funding certain groups, but through actual coups. It mentions the first Gladio coup in Turkey in 1960 and the ongoing support for right-wing groups like the Grey Wolves. It suggests that these stay-behind networks weren't just about, defending against the Soviet invasion. They were also being used to actively shape political outcomes in countries that were allied with the U.S.
And Italy continued to be a major focus for these Gladio operations, mostly because the Italian Communist Party was so strong. And the book goes even further, suggesting that the CIA had a real interest in influencing Vatican politics too. It even hints at their possible involvement in the elections of Pope John Paul III and later Pope Paul VI, who, remember, was Cardinal Montini before he became Pope.
And that brings us to Licio Gelli and his P2 Lodge. The book claims that this organization received a ton of money from the CIA, something like $10 million a month. That's a huge amount of money. And this money was then allegedly used to finance terrorist attacks, not just in Italy, but in other countries too. It's a really shocking claim. It directly links American intelligence to acts of terrorism in Europe. And the book also details Gelli's connections to the Vatican. He apparently got in through William Colby, and he allegedly helped set up these rat lines with a priest named Father Krunoslav Draganovich. These rat lines were used to help Nazi war criminals escape after the war, often using Vatican passports and even using the Vatican Bank to smuggle gold that had been stolen by the Ustasha, a Croatian fascist group.
Yeah, and then there's a whole strategy of tension that was employed in Italy. It involved bombings like the Piazza Fontana attack, which the book links to these CIA-backed right-wing groups like Avanguardia Nazionale. The idea was to create this atmosphere of fear and instability that could then be blamed on left-wing groups, the communists. It was basically a way to discredit them and justify a more authoritarian crackdown.
And then we have Archbishop Marcinkus and his appointment as the head of the Vatican Bank. This was apparently facilitated by Michele Sindona, the financial advisor we talked about earlier. The book emphasizes Marcinkus' close relationship with Sindona and even raises the possibility that Marcinkus himself might have been a Freemason, which would have been, a big no-no for a Catholic archbishop.
And Michele Sindona, he's a fascinating character. The book doesn't portray him as just some, neutral financial advisor. He's described as a key operative connecting the Vatican and the CIA, but also as someone who was actively involved in theft and financial manipulation. He was running his own bank, a Banca Privata Finanziaria, or BPF, and he was doing all sorts of shady stuff, allegedly, and he was able to get away with it because of his connections to powerful people in both the Vatican and the CIA.
And the book details this incredible scheme that Sindona cooked up to gain control of Banco Ambrosiano. He needed Marcinkus' help to pull it off, and apparently he got it. They created all these shell companies in places like Panama and Luxembourg, and Marcinkus supposedly provided letters verifying that these companies were, legitimate Catholic entities, even though they were basically just fronts for Sindona's financial shenanigans.
And it all came crashing down eventually. Sindona's financial empire collapsed, both BPF and the Franklin National Bank in the U.S., and the Vatican reportedly lost a lot of money in the process, which led to a lot of scrutiny of Pope Paul VI and his financial dealings.
And then the book goes back to those coup plots in Italy. This was after Aldo Moro, the prime minister, proposed a coalition government that would have included the Communist Party. This idea was really controversial, and Moro ended up being kidnapped and assassinated. The book suggests that Gladio might have been involved in this.
And then there's the Nuganhan Bank scandal. This bank was based in Australia, but it had deep ties to the CIA and to drug trafficking in Southeast Asia. The book mentions people like Admiral Earl Preston Yates and even William Colby, who we talked about earlier, being connected to this bank.
Operation Gladio also mentions the mysterious death of Pope John Paul I. He was only pope for a very short time, and the circumstances of his death are still, shrouded in mystery. The book says that he had received a report about the Vatican Bank's activities, including these so-called slush funds, right before he died.
And then there's the election of Pope John Paul II and the CIA's continued interest in influencing Vatican affairs. This time, it was about the Solidarity movement in Poland, which was challenging the communist government there. The book suggests that some of the financial support for Solidarity might have come from drug money that was laundered through the Vatican Bank.
Going back to the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, the book talks about Roberto Calvi, who was the head of the bank, trying desperately to prove that the Vatican was actually the owner of those shell companies that Sindona had set up. And Archbishop Marcinkus's letter of patronage, the one that he had written to vouch for those companies, it becomes a key piece of evidence in this whole mess.
And Calvi, he knew too much. He was getting in over his head, and he ended up being murdered in London. He was found hanging from Blackfriars Bridge. It was a very public and very gruesome death. And the investigations that followed revealed just how deep the connections were between the P2 Lodge, the Mafia, and the Vatican Bank.
The book also mentions the Gladio network being involved in terrorist attacks outside of Italy, like the bombing in Bologna, and its activities in Turkey with the Grey Wolves.
And then there's the Bulgarian thesis, which was this disinformation campaign that tried to blame the Soviets for the attempted assassination of Pope John Paul II. The book suggests that some CIA associates and even some people in the Vatican were involved in spreading this disinformation.
The book talks about the crackdown on the P2 Lodge and what that meant for Italian politics. And it also mentions the Emanuela Orlandi case, which was this really sad and mysterious kidnapping of a young girl in Vatican City. There are some theories that connect this case to the Vatican Bank scandals and to Archbishop Marcinkus.
And then, kind of on a different note, but still related, the book talks about the rise of Opus Dei and how the CIA allegedly funneled millions of dollars into that organization in Latin America. This was part of their effort to counter liberation theology, which was seen as a threat because it was aligned with leftist movements.
And finally, we have the end of Michele Sindona. He went to prison. And he started making threats to reveal everything he knew about these secret operations. And then he ended up being poisoned in prison. It was a pretty clear case of someone being silenced. And the book also reminds us that there was an arrest warrant issued for Archbishop Marcinkus because of his role in the Banco Ambrosiano scandal, although he never actually faced any charges.
So it's a complicated and a really dark story. Operation Gladio really makes you question, what was really going on during the Cold War and who was pulling the strings.
Yeah, I mean, the book definitely presents a pretty unsettling picture of the lengths that the U.S. was willing to go to in order to fight communism. They were working with former fascists. They were allegedly involved in the drug trade, and they were carrying out covert operations all over the world. And the Vatican, well, it seems like they were right in the middle of it all.
And it makes you wonder, what are the long-term consequences of these kinds of actions? What happens when intelligence agencies and religious institutions get involved in this kind of stuff? Does the end justify the means? It's a question that we're still grappling with today.
It definitely makes you think. So for you, our listener, what were the big takeaways from this deep dive? What were the things that made you go, whoa, I didn't know that? Did anything surprise you? Did anything make you question what you thought you knew about history?
And here's something to really ponder. If these claims about the CIA and the Vatican are true, what does it say about the nature of power and the lengths that people will go to in order to hold on to it? And how do we ensure that something like this doesn't happen again?
Huge thanks to you, our listener, for suggesting this book and for taking this deep dive with us. It's been a wild ride.
Definitely.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more explorations of, fascinating and often controversial books like Operation Gladio.
And please let us know what you think in the comments below. Tell us your thoughts, share your aha moments, or any questions that you might have. We'd love to hear from you.